Good evening, and welcome to Designing with Plants, the third panel of the series, Let's Talk Plants. This webinar series is a collaboration between the ASLA New York chapter and the ASLA New York Upstate chapter. My name is Annie Pausawad. I am the chair of the Education Committee of the New York chapter. I would like to introduce my co-moderator tonight, also with the New York chapter, Tom Klein. Thank you for dialing in from Denver.
Thanks, Annie. Before we start our panel tonight, we would like to thank our sponsors, Parkitex, Victor Stanley, and Ernst Seeds for their continued support of our chapter. A little about our format tonight. Each panelist will spend a few minutes sharing their insights into designing with plants. Following these brief introductions, we will move into a discussion amongst the panelists and encourage you all to join the conversation by sending questions and insights directly to our panelists via the Q&A dialogue on your screens. For those of you who would like to obtain CEU credit for attending this webinar, we will provide a link to a quiz and evaluation at the conclusion of the webinar. Please note that you must complete both to receive credit. This distance education program has been registered with LACES by the New York chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects. As a registered provider with the LACES system, credits earned on completion of this program will be reported directly to LACES.
Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Gary Hildebrand is a principal of Reed Hildebrand in Cambridge and New Haven. He was the 2017 winner of the ASLA Design Medal and also the Peter Lewis Hornbeck Professor in Practice at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he has taught since 1990. Gary is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, where he was the Mercedes T. Bass Resident in Landscape Architecture. In 2017, he was also named by Design Intelligence as one of America's top 25 educators in design. Welcome, Gary.
Evening, Annie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
And good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining. It is always a beautiful thing to be asked to talk about designing with plants. Let's talk plants. The hard thing about this is that I could do 99 chapters and still have room for more. But I did choose for this evening's talk a slightly more specific topic, which is really the relationship between the stock we buy and plant and the soil that we put it in. And I think it's not unknown to anybody on this call that whatever the practices are by the nursery, by the transporters and shippers, by the plantsmen, and by those who maintain, nothing's more important than paying attention to the interactions in the soil between microorganisms that live in the soil and the product that the trees are making, sugars that they're producing. You simply can't have good health in a tree. Let's stay on that slide, please. You can't have good health in a tree if you don't have strong and repeated and growing interactions in the soil food web. You can fertilize, you can water, you can do all of that stuff. We don't like fertilizing. It's the food web in the soil that really counts. I'm showing you an image at the Storm King Art Center in upstate New York, which is familiar, I know, to many of you. A project initiated a couple of years ago where we decided, after quite long debates with our client at Storm King, to remove 72 maples and to replant an allée that is perhaps one of the most famous spaces on the entire Storm King property of 250 acres. And you can see that we did this in stages. You're seeing just after the installation of our first phase, the trees you're looking at in the distance are Green Mountain maples, practically expired. And the trees you're looking at in the foreground, of course, are Nyssa sylvatica. Let's go to the next slide. Our team, which included the wonderful T. Fleischer and his firm, F Squared Environmental, did lots of work to understand why we had basically a colony collapse of these trees. And so I think it's instructive to kind of pull this problem apart a little bit. Number one, tree maturity. Now, these trees were planted around 1960, and they're sugar maples. Why would they already have over maturity problems? They weren't really meant for this climate. And so that in itself was really an issue of plant selection. Two, the stems of the Green Mountain fight each other for space, and then they decline. And so we had hollowing out canopies in really drastic situations. Planting practices in those days were, tended on the whole to be plant high, better high and dry than low and dead, I think they used to say. There were girdling roots on these trees, and also this plantation went from a lowland to an upland condition, something that sugar maple simply isn't wont to do. And then on the practices side, there were all kinds of maintenance issues. There was a good thing. We found good ladybug habitat. That's a positive, that's a beneficial. Lots of damage by mowers and so on. You can, again, I'm going to repeat it, you can find the very best, own root clone plants in nurseries, maybe with good, root pruning in the nursery, good practices, good growing practices. If the tree isn't in the right place, or that's from a bioregion point of view, and if you don't have good organic soil management practices, you simply will not have good luck and long life for trees like this. Insufficient nutrient cycling was really the biggest problem here, but it was that problem was in a way just festered by all these other issues of the provenance of the trees themselves and the practices that had been visited upon these trees for 60 years or so. Okay, next slide. I now turn to encapsulated soils, which is another place where, again, no matter what, you can do everything you can to avoid girdling roots and rabbit damage and too much mulch and all of that. But when it comes to planting in an encapsulated situation in an urban site like the one shown here, Boston City Hall Plaza, in the schematic design effort that we did over several years, the issue of the soil food web is even more paramount, because as the caption says, this ends up being a kind of closed system, and the dynamic biological activity that is needed for the soil food web to really be working ends up declining over time. And we've examined our soils over 10 and 15-year periods, and they hold up physically well, but their biological activity diminishes. And so we have been really struggling lately on the issue of whether to even bother planting in encapsulated situations like this. So, we work with soil scientists all the time to evolve these practices. We do the very best we can, but we do see diminished productivity in these situations. And the last slide. I say to my students that we talk about performance issues all the time. It has tended to be the rubric for our generations, that ecosystem services and ecological benefits seem to be the thing that we focus on the most. I tell my students that I do want to talk about that. These are paramount issues, but I don't not want to talk about the spatial beauty of the urban canopy. And we can never forget that we work that soil food web so that we can get this beautiful spatial result above, and that never should be far from our discussions. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Gary. So up next, I have the pleasure of introducing Kate Kennen. Kate Kennen is our second speaker, and she is the founder of Offshoots, Inc., a Boston landscape architecture and installation practice focused on productive planting techniques and phytoremediation consulting. She grew up at her family's garden center in central Massachusetts and has earned degrees from Cornell University and Harvard's Graduate School of Design in landscape architecture. Kate's book, co-authored by Niall Kirkwood, called Phyto, Principles and Resources for Site Remediation and Landscape Design, received national awards. She is currently a faculty member of Northeastern University in the School of Architecture. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Tom. So as Tom just mentioned, I grew up on a garden center in central Massachusetts. And you know, every guy who came in with a pickup truck and a shovel called himself a landscaper. And I really quickly realized living at the garden center that the green industry wasn't so green, right? It wasn't necessarily research-based, and there was very, very resource intensive, right? There was the way that we produce and sell plants was very resource intensive, and the water and the fertilization and all of this that we wanted to put into it was just crazy intensive. So I always had this idea of there has to be a different way. And to Gary's last point about ecological services, our whole sort of idea with founding Offshoots was that creating this idea of a new normal for creating productive landscapes, landscapes that are performative, that do something, and actually just don't take away resources. So when we started Offshoots, we actually just started it as a landscape architecture practice, and we're primarily just doing design work. And then we soon realized that if we added horticultural installation and management to the team, we could constantly be researching new ideas. So I call ourselves a hybrid practice because we're a little different in the fact that we design a lot of projects that we don't install, so we're not design build. And we do a lot of horticultural installation and landscape management for other designers as well. So, but the idea is by shortening the distance between the designer and the designed, we can really kind of come to new frontiers in ecological landscapes. So we're really excited about grooming sort of this new generation of what I'm going to call ecological horticulturists, trying to cross over ideas from restoration ecology into horticulture. So next slide, please. So what we've been really trying to do in our design projects is design plant communities and really be thinking about when we're doing planting design, working not in a single species, but of course in a community, right? And so for this particular project shown on the left, Hood Park in Charlestown that we're working on, you know, we're creating these different plant communities that have very, very specific soil and water conditions. You know, we're actually installing acidic lean soils for our pioneer plant community because we don't want to have irrigation long-term and want to think about what is that native community and what does it support. And we often actually design more of these novel ecosystems that may not necessarily be 100% native, or the plants may not have co-evolved, but that will work together in a horticultural setting. Next slide, please. And so, you know, we think about this in a traditional landscape architecture framework that, of course, we're thinking about where is the plant from and what are the other ecological services a plant supports, but we're really also thinking about seasonal interest as we would in sort of any project. What are those different plant communities and what are the kinds of niches that we're trying to fill, whether it be seasonal bloom time or texture or foliage. And when we think about this, you know, there often are places where a non-native bulb palette that is sterile might actually enhance our native planting because we have really long winters here in Boston. And so what are these kind of relationships where we can work the plants back and forth? Next slide. And then, so when we're thinking about these plant communities, obviously we're thinking about the relationships between the plants, the soil, the water, the fertility, and the ongoing long-term landscape care that we're gonna manage, but also about those other ecological relationships. You know, what are the relationships to the birds and animals that occupy the area? And, you know, really importantly is sometimes maybe native might not always be the best, you know, source for our plant community. So in this particular example, this is also at the same project. One of our plant communities is actually based on a concept of phytoremediation. So here we have a groundwater contaminant plume that is contaminated with petroleum. And we're looking at using a non-native hybrid poplar species that has one native parent and one non-native, but grows at a faster rate per year than most species to be able to clean up the contaminated groundwater. And also we're looking at air particulate matter. We're right next to a Highway 93 with lots and lots of air particulates. We know that through phytoaccumulation, we can use species with thicker, waxier leaves, and we can have, and in this case, we're actually using aspen and some other actually native species for that. So you always need to look at context, but in that whole frame, we are looking at sort of the whole entire ecological services of the plant. And we're excited to talk about the discussions of how we, form these plant communities for the best long-term care.
Thank you, Kate. Our last speaker, Wemboy Ippolito, is a designer and horticulturist. She is the first and only Black female graduate of the New York City Botanical Garden School of Professional Horticulture. She develops programming for museums, public gardens, and parks, exploring the broader context of horticulture, focusing on the intersections between migration, design, history, culture, and science. She is the founder of the BIPOC Hort Group, a professional organization with membership from the US, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Welcome, Wemboy.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. So I was born in East Africa. I was born and grew up for the earlier part of my life in East Africa, and then lived around the world because of the work that my parents did. So I work with and consult with a lot of landscape architects, designers, and horticulturalists in Latin America, primarily here in the US and also in Africa. And thank you, Kate, thank you, Gary, for your wonderful talks, because you touched on topics that I want to speak on today. The first one being plant communities, and a problem that I find with very many designers that I work with here in America who don't really understand how plant communities work, especially here in the city where I work a lot in Soho, Tribeca, up into Westchester, Long Island. So for all the people who are watching today, I think what I would most want you to understand when you approach a site is understanding what's already growing there, and not seeing it as a blank palette, which is what we do so much, is we come in and we see a blank slate and we're gonna fill it in without really looking at what's already growing there. What are the weeds, what are the shrubs, what's growing there, and how are they growing? Because they start to show you how the communities are gonna work in that site, and whether or not you're even going to have to amend that soil. Kate, I was interested in what you said about the phytoremediation and working to clean contaminated soils. I don't know if you've worked at all with mushrooms. That's some of the work that I do, working with, following Paul Stamets' ideas of how mushrooms can be used in design to clean up soil. Which means that you don't have to truck in new soil or work extensively to clean up the soil that's already on site. So looking at the site in that sense, looking at what is already growing there. This is a picture of where I grew up in East Africa. The tall plant is Lobelia telekii. If you look at this, you could even think that a designer, came up with this scene, but this is how everything grows at home. So this is a picture that I use in my design, or when I consult with landscape architects, especially those that I work with in Chile who work in a very xeriscape environment. Could we move to the next slide, please? So I put this in here for color, understanding how color works. And I'm going to talk about a problem that I had 2 years ago when I worked with a very famous landscape architect who was putting in a meadow here in Westchester for a very big client. So this designer, who is American, wanted to have this wonderful, beautiful meadow, and had all these beautiful plants that he installed into the that we installed into the meadow. Much of which was Solidago canadensis. Anybody who works with Solidago knows that once Solidago's in, or Rudbeckia, which was the other main plant that we used, it's going to take over, right? Now, had we spent time in this acreage before we put in the meadow, we would have already seen what was growing in there. We would have already understood what the communities were that were in there naturally. And it would have given us an idea of what we could you know, first of all, what kind of soil we have. Is it acidic? Is it non-acidic? You know, and what kind of plants we could put in, and what kind of color scheme we would build, we could build based on the soils that were present, based on whatever was growing in there already. So for me, growing in the Rift Valley, in the savannah, and seeing the colors of the savannah, it has helped me so much in my work today. When I approach a site, when I approach what's going to be a meadow in Westchester, I can see clearly and pull back from this understanding that I have from you know, growing up in East Africa or living in South America, and seeing how these vast plateaus work, how the plants in these vast plateaus work. Could we move on to the next slide? So the other thing is form, and the need to understand how nature forms herself without our nudging, helping hand, right? This is a picture, again, Chile, in a location near a property that one of my collaborators works on. This has helped me so much in understanding how to form a garden, how water flows in a garden, how wind comes through a garden, how color works in a garden. I have friends who work at the Highline today, and who in the Battery Park, both of which Pete Udolph designed, and they tell me about all the problems that they have today, because the initial design, when installed at the Battery Park or at the Highline, just, you know, completely didn't work. There are areas in those gardens that didn't work, because I think in the initial stages, and I know that I'm treading on very thin ice here because I'm nowhere in the level of Pete Udolph, a lot of how a landscape forms was not understood, and especially how a landscape forms in a disused urban setting. So this is a slide that helps me. It always takes me back to remembering to look at a landscape and try and understand how it has formed itself without man's intrusion. And that helps in the design moving forward. Could we move to the next slide, please? So this is my favorite garden in the whole wide world. This is James Bassen. I haven't worked with James, but this is James Bassen, who is a landscape architect. This garden won the Chelsea Best in Show in 2017. I don't know if any of you know this garden, but this is what I feel that the Highline could have been, or other gardens that are very much influenced by that whole Highline aesthetic. So this garden was based on an abandoned Maltese quarry. And some of the plants that were planted in here were brought in with special permission from the Maltese government, you know, for this design. And looking at it, it looks just like how weeds grow, how plants grow in a disused area. And I think that this aesthetic is something that we should think about as we move forward, as we especially working in urban areas where so much of the drive now and the momentum now is working with native plants. I urge you all to read up on James Bassen's work, and especially this garden, which won Best in Show, which may not have been what all the people who came to the garden liked, but it won because of his full understanding of how plants actually work in disused sites, in urban sites, in reclaimed sites, you know, in cities, you know. So that's it for me. Thank you. We could talk more during the discussion.
Thank you, Wemboy. And thank you, everyone. All those slides were very exciting and very beautiful. And I just wanted to start by saying me and Tom will ask some questions, but I also encourage you guys on the panelists, feel free to ask each other as well. And we'll get to the mushroom question for Kate in a second. But I'd like to kick off the questions by asking each of you guys a two-part question in reverse order. I'm going to start with Wemboy. So you mentioned in your work, you frequently get called in and to sometimes fix failing plant designs. So part one, what would you consider a successful planting design and planting selection? And what is your advice to designers in achieving it?
So the first part, a successful planting design or successful garden is one where the least amount of intrusion has occurred by the landscape architect or the horticulturalist, where whatever soil is present can work, you know, whatever plants are put in will live. So there's no need for this seasonal cycle of renewal, you know, of these plants died and the constant having to replace plants, and where the soil can be left on its own, and where, if anything, we could use peat and gravel beds, you know, for lessening irrigation, you know, lessening the need for weeding, you know, making it as easy as possible for nature to take her course whilst, you know, using the least amount of water, the least amount of maintenance possible. Because I think that we are at a point in the world right now where we really have to be clear about being land stewards, you know, as opposed to just making money, you know. And so much of the horticultural industry is money driven, you know. When looking for contracts, we look for maintenance contracts. We look for the type of work where we know we will constantly be called, you know. But I think that there has to be a shift in our thinking to think about how to let the land work best for itself. That's the first part. And what was the second question? I'm sorry.
Oh, what would be your advice to designers?
My advice would be to try and learn as much as you can, widen your optic as much as you can by learning from designers outside this country. Especially for, you know, and I would say this anywhere I was in the world. I grew up learning horticulture in a very organic, plant community based way, you know. So the tree was the foundation around which we planted everything else, as opposed to a tree being an ornament that we move around the landscape. So all the landscape architects that I know from elsewhere, you know, in the countries that I've lived in, which happen to be second or third world countries, always saw the tree as the anchor, and then the community was built around that tree, as opposed to how I learned horticulture here, which is very ornamental, where everything moves around the landscape. So I think if anything, that is what I would want people to understand. I hope I answered that.
Oh yes, you did. I'm going to ask Kate the same thing. Same two questions. In what is your understanding, or what do you consider as successful planting design and selection, and what is your advice to designers?
I mean, obviously it's incredibly context sensitive, right? It's based on who your client is and what the site is, and to determine what's successful in one context is going to be completely different than another one, right? A large, you know, ecological restoration site is going to be so different than a small urban park and what is successful. But I would say, you know, once you kind of zoom into that, you can make some assessments. But you know, of course, to follow up on the same things that I said before, for us, we do measure ecological services as much as cultural services. So we'd like to measure almost in the same way that you measure sustainability, right? People, planet, profit, right? And thinking about those metrics of like, of what are sustainability measures, what are cultural measures that's gonna make it successful to the client or the people that visit it, and then what's gonna make it economically successful. And I think all of those are important, and I think we have to weigh them the same way we do in any sort of weight and sustainability project. And so, you know, I think the best way to often to get to a really good design is through research, right? And for me, the research question might be different in every project. On one project where phyto makes a lot of sense, we're going to be doing a lot of research in phyto in the soil community, and maybe actually building a pioneer plant community that's actually going to rehabilitate the soil as well as remediating the contaminants at the same time. And, you know, the next question on a different project could be completely different. And we might trying to do a deep dive into the horticulturists and people who really understand those systems, I think is incredibly critical, and not pretending to know everything, to really going in and finding the specialists for those systems.
It's your turn, Gary.
Okay. That's a beautiful question, Annie. I'm going to say that for me personally, the most successful planting is the one that stirs my heart and my emotions and my intellect. And maybe I'll add, something that I feel has spatial beauty. So I didn't say anything about all the stuff I talked about a few minutes ago, or the stuff that Wambui talked about as well, because the top line for me is that planting can be, wants to be, in my view, a cultural expression, a meaningful cultural expression, and maybe even a poetical work of art. And that is, for me, 300 American elm trees in the Central Park on the mall, or 40 multi-stemmed honey locusts in Battery Park City at the South Cove. When I first walked down the new Esplanade in Battery Park City in 1982 or 3, I came to that place where you have to make a left, right? So you're going down this long, straight boardwalk, and then you have to take a left. And I saw these honey locusts and grasses. I recognized the Hudson River that I grew up on 60 miles further north. It came back to me like that. It was moving to me. It was stimulating to me. And now, there were no plants growing there. That was built on a deck. Completely artificial condition. So in the second part of the question, for me, it isn't beautiful if it isn't growing well. And so, there are many things that are attendant to the first thing, including whether the plants are appropriate whether they are well adapted to the situation, and whether or not the interchanges that need to occur in the soil, whether that's a native existing soil or a manufactured soil, as the case was in the Battery Park City, that those things are attendant to the thing that's more important to me, which is spatial and poetic beauty.
Gary, so thinking about the cultural expression you mentioned in this, oftentimes we're brought back to this idea of native plants as being a part of that cultural identity. And we actually have a question from one of our participants. Jason asks, is there a percentage of a sweet spot mix of appropriate native to non-native plants that helps make a successful and sustainable landscape? And I'm curious if Gary, you could take that on, and then afterwards, if Kate, you could jump in, because I know you mentioned in your design, you're not always using 100% natives, and that in particular, when working on phytoremediation projects, you are using a mix of well-adapted non-native cultivars. So Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I don't use the distinction native in our work, and I try actually to get our clients to not try to depend on something that is fixed in geologic time. And so I really prefer well-adapted plants. The plants that are growing in the region today, or just as importantly, and I saw another question here about this, the plants that we anticipate will accommodate to what we know are to be dramatically changing conditions in our climate and our weather. I mean, the bioregions are moving, it's well demonstrated, and so we have actually to think about the plants that aren't growing here. The mangroves are already in Georgia, and they will be in North Carolina soon. And so these changes are really, I think, going to cause yet another kind of seismic shift in the notion of nativity, plant nativity. So I'm okay using cultivars, and I don't really try to measure. I prefer species. So like if I'm going to plant the sugar maple, which is increasingly a problem in our climate, I would like to plant the native. I would never plant the green mountain. I mean the species, Acer saccharum, and not use the cultivar. So anyway, I don't want to take too much time, but I have a kind of strong view on that, and I appreciate that you put us together with differing views.
Yeah, I mean, Gary, I think that was really well said, because, you know, the definition of native is obviously incredibly different, whoever that you speak to. If you go to the Boston Conservation Commission, the definition of native is native to the state as shown on the USDA maps. That was, you know, native pre-colonial settlement, right? But the challenge is that that plant community is totally different, as he, you know, so described before. Native Americans shifted our plant species here in the Northeast on the coast with fire for so long. Whether, you know, we dominantly have oak groves and berry underneath because they were burned for long to be able to have that kind of nut and berry growth. And so our landscapes were managed for long before the European colonists were here. And having this kind of tight definition of what is native to our Boston bioregion, I don't think is that helpful. And so since this, you know, panel is kind of on native plants, the first thing you always have to do is define, what does native mean to you? And to me, again, we just always keep bringing it back to this question of ecological services and what gets provided. And that really helps us define whether what we think that we are moving towards is going to be a good direction or not.
Thank you. Annie, did you want to bring up a question about mushrooms? I know that during the discussion, we had an interesting dialogue between Wamboy and Kate about mushrooms. I think you had.
I think Annie might be muted.
Yeah, I think Annie's having some technical difficulties. So I guess I'll ask the question. So I'm interested. Oh,
you can go ahead, Tom.
okay. So Wamboy, you were mentioning mushrooms as being used as a phytoremediation tool.
Yes.
For the cleaning of soils, and
Yes.
I'm interested in whether or not. So in my experience, which is very limited in working with phytoremediation, and this is, so I think maybe Wamboy can answer first and then Kate can jump in. It can be really challenging to know whether or not the plant material is actually cleaning the soil, right? So you have different depths of contamination, you have different types of contamination. And we had, you know, for example, in St. Louis, I recall a project in which we used sunflowers to try and contaminate lead, and the lead was too deep for the sunflowers to adequately
or ineffective.
Sorry. Ineffective, yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious if you've had any success using mushrooms or other plants for the remediation of soil, and what types of methods you're using to test and verify that the plant material is actually working in doing so.
So I am a very great disciple of Paul Stamets, the famous mushroom professor. I urge everybody to get his book, what is it, mycorrhizae something, anyway, Paul Stamets. So this is all new to me because I will be working on a project in Nairobi, and in a very, very contaminated urban area in Nairobi. And I was listening to Paul Stamets and his use of mushrooms and the mycorrhizal networks, and the way they move through the soil, cleaning up all this lead and whatever other poison he has found in urban areas. So this is all new to me, and that's why I mentioned it to Kate, because I'm still learning about this. I'm still reading about this. I want to go up to the Pacific Northwest and see how he's using these mushrooms to clean up, but he's very trustworthy, so this is not quackology. You know, this is Paul Stamets. So I pretty much urge everybody to Mycelium Running. There it is. That is the name of the book, Mycelium Running. I don't know if you've all read it, but thank you, Jeanette and Coma said for putting that in the discussion. So yes, so I think that is something that everybody on this panel should read up on, because that might be the next phase in soil remediation. And I don't know if any of you have heard about it, Gary or Kate, if you've heard about
No,
it.
of course, of course.
Yeah.
Paul's work has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
It's extremely interesting and promising.
Yeah, and especially for people who live in second and third world regions that are so contaminated, and that want to move into the first world.
Yeah,
you know.
I think a good comment just came. So, I mean, as Tom knows, you know, I've been studying phytoremediation for 10 years, and we specifically didn't talk about myco because Paul is really the expert on that strategy. And in our work, I mean, the biggest thing that everyone should know is phyto and myco, none of them are a silver bullet. You know, they are living systems that it's not always going to work, and it's very plant and contaminant specific. And the very, very quick 1 second phyto lesson, there's organic contaminants and inorganic contaminants. Inorganic contaminants are contaminants on the periodic table, like arsenic, cadmium, zinc. Lead, you cannot break them down into smaller parts. So the way that the plant works in that system is going to be completely different than an organic contaminant that you break down. So anyways, the devil is in the details. I could do, you know, 2-3 hour lectures on phyto, which I do constantly. So if you guys are interested in phyto, you know, happy to do that at some point. But since we're kind of, you know, focused on the native plant side of it, the big challenge, I think the question in this sort of context is, you know, it's another ecological service or thing to consider. Is the right plant always native to the bioregion from before? It may not be, especially in a very difficult soil urban context, or a place that has a legacy of some other use.
And as a migrant, I just want to say that there's a whole world of migrant plants in America that are very unknown and underutilized, that landscape architects should find a way into to learning about and finding about. I work with some immigrant groups here, groups that are able to through Catholic relief organizations or immigrant relief organizations gain access to land to grow. And some of the things that I've seen growing there, I mean, are just incredible in what they do, you know. In terms of nitrogen with the soil or what. So there's like a whole other world of immigrant horticulture happening large scale that not too many people are keyed into. And I think that's like the next level of learning in this sphere.
That's beautiful. I think it's socially oriented, and yet it's deeply environmental. So that's really very stimulating to me.
Yeah,
I use the term migration is an important term for us right now because of it's a political term as well, right? You know, it's the bioregions are migrating. You know, there's salt migration into farmland all along the East Coast. So the marshes are migrating into the farms. And then, you know, we have, you know, the world crisis of social migration as well. I mean, it's one world, and these things are interconnected. I love hearing about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and just anybody who lives in the East Coast, just that drive from Maryland through Jersey, right before you get into New York City on both sides of 95, there are all these farms and there's all this land in use by people who are very recent migrants, you know, large scale, you know, and those are the things that I'm so interested in, and I visit these farms just to see the processes they use, no irrigation in 20, 30, 40 acres of land, and yet they have such successful harvests, 3 times a year in a season, 3 times, how they plant, how they structure the plant communities, I mean, so much of this is edible. Some of it is to fulfill like ornamental needs in immigrant communities, but it's just fascinating that nobody has really ever spent time and money studying that and the new cultivars that we don't even know, that are being brought into. I mean, I know Nigerian farms, Zimbabwean farms, Korean farms, Liberian farms, so these are just new things that we can.
Well, can I ask you if you see any tension between what you spoke so beautifully about around using the plants that grow in this soil here, and the migration you spoke about, which is human, it's accelerated by humans. There's a tension there, no?
Yes, but I think that my optic has widened enough now that I understand that we are yet to see the 3rd wave of large-scale immigration into America. We had that first wave in the 1600s. We had that second 1920s wave, that Ellis Island wave, and everybody thinks that like America is static right now. The plants that are here, and everything else that's coming in is an invasive. But we don't know that there might be another huge 3rd wave come in on the scale of the last 2 that we saw, and that the American landscape is completely going to be altered within the next 50 years. I truly believe this. I truly believe this. I truly believe that in the next 20 years, there's going to be a complete demographic change in the United States. We don't know where it's going to come from, but with the acceleration and momentum of what's going on geopolitically around the world, it's bound to happen. It happened twice before. It happened in the 1600s when that drive to come to America was all about timber, getting timber to send back to the UK and Europe. And then we had that large scale in the second wave in the 1920s of hundreds of thousands of millions of people. And what's to say that this isn't going to happen again? And now in this accelerated mode that we're on geopolitically, it's going to happen. So I think what's coming is just going to completely shock us in a good way, I hope. And that the plants that are coming here, the insects that are coming here, the fungi that's coming in on people, the spores that are coming in on people's clothes are going to completely change America, just like the earthworms changed America in the 1620s, Mm-hmm. So I think there's a 3rd wave coming. And
well, boy, that reminds me of one thing you said is let nature do its work.
Yes.
When you were talking about your philosophy of planting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not to hog the dialogue here, but I have this real love-hate relationship with the High Line, just because I can truly see what Pete Udolph was trying to do, and it was such a beautiful idea to have this beautiful meadow in the middle of New York. But I remember how brokenhearted I was when the work started, because I thought about all that was already living there in a very organic way, and was completely destroyed, from whatever was growing in the ground to the birds, the bees, the rats, the rodents, that all went away to create this meadow. You know what I mean? So like that last slide I showed of James Bassen, are you both familiar with James Bassen, mm-hmm. who did the that to me would have been the perfect High Line, had whatever was in there just kind of been edged in, or cleaned up, but left to continue doing its thing. I think that would have been the perfect meadow for the High Line. That was a real heartbreaker for me when I saw the High Line come in, because I just thought about here, you already had this wonderful, established, natural, native, I mean, I don't know if you could call it a meadow before, but you know, this installation that was natural, that could have just been edged in and walkways created, and that would have been a real, you know, something alive, you know. Whereas now, you know, with all the build, and you know, of course we don't know what's going to happen 10 years out, but now you have all these wind tunnels, you have all these you know, high rises coming in, all the shadows, you know, the magnolias are dying, you know. So I think that is what I feel about the Highline, and I think I answered your question, Annie, in a kind of
well, on that note too. So you mentioned this idea of there's the new wind tunnels happening because all these new mid-rise and high-rise buildings, and they're plants that are no longer able to thrive in that condition. And so a question for Gary and then maybe Kate, from Meg in the comments here, is it's challenging to find all the layered info on individual plant species and where they will thrive and how they will thrive, right? So how do you determine what the right plant is for the right place? Do you have any kind of resources you've gone to over the years that maybe those of us on the call might not know about? Or even maybe potentially some ways in which you go about designing with plants that takes this into account in a way that maybe we're overlooking?
Yeah, I have to say that there are so many demands on a design team for, you know, depending on the situation, to be applying knowledge in ways that are productive. But I am going to just mention that my two good friends, Daryl Morrison and Stephen, Stephen.
You're talking about, I'm sorry, Handel?
Yeah, Handel.
Okay.
No, that's embarrassing. That's embarrassing in front of 72 New Yorkers. These two.
We'll edit that out of the video, don't we?
These two gentlemen have just been invaluable to me in working on projects because they are closer to the plants than I am. And, you know, Daryl, I think, you know, really is just such a legend in the idea that we would plant well-adapted species, and that our main expressive potential is in those plants that are best adapted. This is a beautiful, beautiful idea. And I think, you know, Stephen's kind of mania about how interactions occur in a site, whether it's City Hall Plaza or, you know, an abandoned railroad track running through the west side of Manhattan, or as he's helping us now with, you know, the edge of the woods that will have to be cleared for a pretty major intervention in the Storm King landscape. It takes more than a person to understand the innumerable interactions that we have to take care of, that we have to try to get at least the principal ones right. And it's not a book, it's not a list, it's not a website. It's actually knowledge that comes from working in the field. And this is the indispensable knowledge that we have to apply in order to make sure that we're using the right plants in the right space in the right soil.
I worked with Daryl too. I'm sorry, Kate. I just want to say I worked with Daryl two years ago on a